The Spin-off Podcast Network.
Raising capital or taking your business to the world? Investment Fix has everything you need to make it happen. This season, we're exploring the US market, the opportunities it offers, what it takes to grow a business there, and the best way to approach investors. The Investment Fix podcast. Tune in today.
The Fold is brought to you by oOh!media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. Tēnā koutou, Duncan Greive here. Thank you so much for listening to The Fold in 2023. Taking a little break over summer and would like to sort of bring you some of my favourite conversations from throughout the year. So please enjoy this while I take a short break, and we'll be back mid-late January. Here's one of my favourites, Mā te wā. No mai hoki mai ki a The Fold, e mihi ne ko Duncan Greive tōku ingoa. My guests today are Red Nicholson and Olivia Shivas, both of a very new website platform called The D-List. It is a place for disabled storytelling. It's essentially a culture magazine about disabled people in Aotearoa. And I've been lucky enough to work a little bit with the pair of them over the past couple of months while they're readying for launch, and I just don't think I've rarely, if maybe ever, come across such a singular and brilliant idea, so well articulated and so sort of scrutinized and cared for as I have with the D-List. I think that they have really hit upon this kind of problem that probably every disabled person could identify, and that just the broader media hasn't been able to figure out for reasons which they detail on this podcast. So I think this is it's a bit of a landmark, this launch. I have huge hopes for it. It's well funded so that it can run for multiple years, and I think in Red it has a leader, a publisher who has a really specific vision for it, and Olivia is just the perfect person to be editing it. So yeah, enjoy this conversation with Red Nicholson and Olivia Shivas on The Fold. Kia ora korua and welcome to The Fold. So thrilled to have you along. I wondered if you could start by just quickly introducing yourselves and talking, I guess, about your journeys to the start line of the D-List. Red, do you want to come in first?
Kia ora. Yeah, well, it's kind of been a weird and winding trajectory for me. I actually started my life as a high school teacher. I taught at the mighty and wonderful Onihongo High School for about 8 years. I was an English and media studies teacher, and I loved my time there. I think it really lit my passion for social justice. You know, I've always been interested in disability issues and disability rights, but I think that intersected in a very visceral way during my time as a high school teacher. And then I sort of did a bit more study and came out and have been working for the last 5 years at a creative agency. So I've been working at Curative, which is all about kind of the intersection between community and social marketing and advertising and communications. And so it's been a real wild ride the last sort of 13 years or so. But I think in some ways it's all the ingredients that has been necessary to launch this project into the world. So that's been really exciting.
And you, Olivia?
So I always knew I wanted a career and to work in the media. I did all the right subjects at high school. If I went to Onihanga, Red would have been my teacher for multiple subjects with English and media studies. And so I did a Bachelor of Communication Studies majoring in journalism. And my first kind of real job after that was actually working at Attitude Pictures. So I was a researcher and digital producer there, working kind of on their online platforms. And that was a really good start to kind of like get my head into like disability media and storytelling. And then for the last 5 years, I've been at Stuff. So I've had various roles there as digital producer, homepage editor, and most recently a reporter on the Potiaki team telling disability stories.
It does seem like both of your lives have almost been leading to this one moment when you put it that way. Red, I was wondering if you could start by just giving me a sense, before we talk about the D-list itself, give me a sense of what you perceive as the current state of media for or about people with disabilities. Like you've got, from our conversations, a pretty specific diagnosis of how, hopefully, let's give them some credit, well-intentioned outlets can still end up recycling over familiar tropes in a way that the D-list intends to be quite a powerful counter to.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky one, right? Because I think stories and narratives play such a profound role in how we shape our understanding of the world and of people. And I think there are a number of players in the kind of disability narrative space that have been doing really important work for a long period of time. I think what is true also is that the time has come for a shift in those dominant paradigms. I mean, my friend Philip Paxton talks about the 3 T's of disability storytelling, the 3 tropes being stories about trauma, stories about tragedy, and stories about triumph over disability. And I think the unfortunate kind of cumulative effect of those tropes and their prevalence is that we tend to see disability through these quite deficit-based paradigms. We see disability as a tragedy that has befallen someone, a traumatic event that has somehow, diminished their personhood or their existence, or we see disability as this obstacle that you need to overcome in order to be as normal as everyone else. And I think what's really fascinating about looking at those stories as a disabled person is just how disconnected and almost wildly kind of oppositional they are to the lives that we lead. If you know disabled people, they're some of the most hilarious, creative, sassy, salty people that you could hope to meet. And yet the stories that are told about us are these like weirdly infantilized, paternalistic narratives. And so I think there's just a natural kind of space that has just been sitting there for ages, waiting for someone or waiting for the right kind of moment, the right funding environment, the right ingredients to come together to offer something and to actually fill the gap for stories told by disabled people, for disabled people, and yes, for disabled people, but also in such a way that the folks who are natural allies of disability communities can get behind and kind of revel in those magic stories as well that right now are just kind of missing from the zeitgeist.
No, that's a really powerfully put. So, Olivia, prior to now, you worked for Stuff, which is the largest employer of journalists in the country. What was that experience like for you? Thinking probably more so about your time on Potiaki, both in terms of the scope of your work and its impact.
Yeah, well, I think I was quite lucky at Stuff. I got to kind of like be in the hustle and bustle of a busy newsroom as a digital producer, kind of not doing any disability storytelling. I did a lot of kind of live events, live blogging, live streams, breaking news. And so it was quite nice just to like figure out the mechanics of a big news organisation like Stuff and be a part of that every day. And so, but I still always noticed when there were stories about disabled people that I was just like, cringing, that Red described. And, I think as someone with a disability and having quite a visible disability with being, using a wheelchair, you can kind of see how those stories kind of translate into your everyday life. Just how people read the news and then how they treat you in real life is quite funny. I mean, the other day, I think I was going for lunch and me and then, a walking non-disabled friend were just on the road and someone came up to me and said, "You're really awesome, And they didn't say it to the other person, just directly at me. And I wish my friend was like, "Nah, she's a real dickhead." Like, I just... But I guess, just transitioning from, being very aware of those types of stories. And so then when I transitioned into the Potiaki team at Stuff, just telling disability stories, it was a real scary but exciting moment because I knew I had this I feel like I had this responsibility to disabled people to tell stories that they could relate to, tell stories that we've been wanting to tell for a long time but were never told or hadn't been told from the right kind of angle, the right perspective. So I think it was, it was really cool. I really hope I did a good job, and maybe I didn't do it perfectly all the time. But I think just knowing that I was a disabled person telling these stories made a difference to what you'd seen in the past.
So, I mean, that kind of sets up really the D-list itself. Red, tell me about this idea, because it's quite a profound one in terms of its intention versus even the likes of Attitude, which has been a very big, really the dominant player in this space for such a long time. But when we first met, you explained it to me, and I felt like it was one of the most pure, kind of coherent ideas for a new media platform that I've heard in some time. What is the genesis of the idea?
It's actually got a really rich origin story, which I'm just kind of low-key obsessed with, because I think it's very easy for these things to emerge as a kind of on the back of an individual or the back of a couple of individuals. But the truth is that this project actually emerged from quite an extraordinary co-design process. So it was in 2020, and the then Disability Rights Commissioner, Paula Tesoriero, she's always been very kind of emphatic that if we want to see real changes for disabled people in terms of social outcomes, health outcomes, education, employment, because, you name the social statistic and disabled people are very much at the bottom of the heap right now. And her kind of thesis was, well, if we started to address some of the attitudes that sat behind the kind of people who work within those systems, we might actually get some substantive outcome and changes in terms of outcomes as well. So she was always really kind of passionate about this idea that if we can change attitudes, we can change outcomes. And if you think about the way we have historically looked at, thought about, talked about disability, it is very much through that kind of deficit charity-based mindset. So at the time, Curative and the wonderful team headed up by Eddie Royal there came together alongside the Human Rights Commission and actually alongside disability communities more broadly to undertake this quite extensive co-design process. So over about a year, we spoke with over 200 disabled people, non-disabled people, to really get to the bottom of what are those attitudes out there that are preventing disabled people from kind of participating fully in society, from having the job they want, from attending the school they want. And I think the idea going in was that we might make some sort of campaign off the back of that. And, you can imagine what something like that would look like, right? It would be a series of TVCs and posters, and it would be like, treat disabled people just like you want to be treated. And we've done that before, we've been there, we've done that, we've done the whole disability awareness thing. And what we actually realized through that process, that what was missing in this whole jigsaw puzzle was something for disabled people ourselves. We held these workshops, these hui, these talanoa spaces where disabled people came together, and it was just revelatory. There was this real magic, surprise, surprise, in bringing people together who experience the world in a similar way, but who are also kind of wanting to create something better, something that doesn't exist right now. And so there was this real magic, actually, that happened in these spaces where we just brought disabled people together with no non-disabled people around. There was no kind of weird power dynamic. There was no one controlling the space. It was just us. And this kind of, visceral kind of raucous joy that comes from when you bring people together who experience the world in a similarly unique way. And so I think from that process, what we identified was that the opportunity here was not to make something else for non-disabled people to raise their awareness, because we've been banging that drum for a long time. And look, it had its place and it still does, right? We've got to keep doing that work. But we sort of had this moment where we were like, well, what about us? What are we making just for disabled people? What are we doing to kind of reflect our own worlds back at us in a way that's congruent with our own real experiences? Because right now, and Olivia spoke to it before, the experience of consuming disability media as a disabled person is like being gaslit 24/7, because the stories that you see told about you are nothing like the worlds and the relationships and the experiences that you have yourself, And so I think there was an opportunity to create something pretty unique and create something aspirational and replenishing and joy-filled and sassy and a bit dark, because humour sometimes is what gets us through the hard stuff. So this isn't by any means saying that disability is marvellous and wonderful and all sort of happy and fluffy 24/7. It is absolutely about acknowledging the tough stuff, but it's about acknowledging the tough stuff in a way that is, that is true to us and our experiences of the world.
I mean, yeah, it's such an interesting point you make about the how this should be. If this is the problem, which I think you've very explained quite brilliantly there, what is the solution? It does feel like very frequently the sort of typical government response is let's do a campaign so that we can say that we did a thing. Maybe it works a bit for a period of time, but that kind of a TVC, which is inevitably reductive, and maybe some outdoor posters and so on. It's just with something as enormous and complex as the world that you're and nuanced as the world that you're discussing. It just feels like it's inevitably going to barely scratch the surface and be something you do to say that you've done it rather than something profound. But the flip side of that is, if the government is very happy to fund campaigns, it's not very often in the business of funding a startup media organisation. That's an altogether more complex question to answer. How did you go about that side of building the sort of financial case so that you could actually, hire Olivia and get to work?
So there's so many layers to this, and that would almost be another episode in and of itself. So I'll try to keep it as kind of top line as I can, but I think there's a couple of factors that played into it. The first is that the partner driving this whole thing from the beginning was Te Kahui Tika Tangata, the Human Rights Commission, and the fantastic staff there. And I think Paula, obviously she's moved on now into her new role at Whaikaha, but Paula was a huge gift to this project in terms of the trust that she engendered within those community spaces. So we had Paula in our corner, we had the Human Rights Commission in our corner, we had an amazing group of funders who have been on this journey for 2 years now. So before we had funders, philanthropic funders commit to this project, they stayed on this journey for 12, 18 months, and that was quite intentional. And so they were part of the co-design process. They received regular updates through the thing. So we really made a conscious effort from the beginning to bring those funders on the journey with us. So when the moment came to say, hey, listen, we're ready to go, do you want to support us to really make this thing happen? They were absolutely, all in, because they'd seen the rigor, the depth, the kind of substance of the co-design process. And so I think in many ways, and obviously, the creative team have got a really strong track record in the social marketing space. And I think what we proposed in the end was yes, this is a media organisation, and yes, this is about telling stories by us, for us, but it's also all about community development. It's all about actually nurturing the next generation of disabled storytellers and creatives. If this was just the Olivia and Red show, there's no way that this would have the legs that it needs to have. What this needs to be very much a broad church, and our work has to be about growing the capability and capacity of disabled people to contribute to this work. I mean, I make no secret about the fact that I had a huge amount of internal turmoil about the conversations that I was having about potentially bringing Olivia over to the D-list, because she's basically one of our only disabled journalists in the country. And I think when you're dealing with such a taonga and such a treasured resource in terms of our ability to advocate for our own people and tell our own stories, we've got no choice but to grow the number of people who can contribute to that work. And so I think one of the things I'm so excited about with the D-list and the opportunity that it presents is the fact that we have this time, we have resource to really commit to making sure that Olivia's not carrying the entirety of all that disability communities on her shoulders as as one of a handful of disabled journalists. I think we have a real responsibility to yes, tell our stories, but do so in a way that brings up the next generation with us.
So, Olivia, obviously you're a crucial part of this. You're the editor of the publication, but at the same time, you were in a position, as Red says, this one which must have felt both for you personally and for your community of huge importance. What was it about Red's pitch that made you confident that this was the right move? And it must have been like one that felt kind of, if not freighted with risk, it certainly was a move away from a fantastic gig into the unknown to some extent.
Yeah, well, I think Red also mentioned time, and I think that's one thing I'm really grateful that he gave me a lot of time to think about it. And I think initially I was like, that's nice, but no thanks. And so, because again, I loved my job at Stuff. I loved the Potiaki team, and the work that I was doing there was so important. And so, like I told so many people, it was my dream job. And so to think about not how my life personally would look different, but yeah, that contribution to like the whole media landscape, what that would look like. Yeah, it was a huge kind of burden on my shoulders to think about. And I think when I was telling, some of my bosses at Stuff about it and the opportunity and things like that, I think, I got quite emotional telling all of them because they know how much I love the job and the work that we do there. But I think what really helped was, one of my news directors said you've got to really follow your purpose. You don't need to, you shouldn't be aligning yourself with a company or an organisation because who knows what will happen in the future. But when you really align yourself with your purpose, and I really feel like this is that same purpose in terms of storytelling about disabled people. And I think the fact that we are unapologetically disabled and the audience is disabled is really special, just because we don't need to, I guess, water down what we're trying to communicate, whereas, like Red said, that kind of advocacy journalism and awareness stuff that I was doing at Stuff is important. But in a way, I did kind of have to maybe perhaps tone down some of the stuff so it was more palatable for a non-disabled audience. So here it's really cool because we can be, in terms of our content, it can be a lot more unapologetic, but also, we kind of asking those questions that only disabled people would kind of have the audacity to ask.
The Fold is brought to you by O Media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa, with over 4,000 out-of-home advertising sites nationwide across both street furniture and retail centres. I'm super grateful to O Media for enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.
Raising capital or taking your business to the world? Investment Fix has the lowdown on everything you need to make it happen. This season, we're exploring the US market, the opportunities it offers, what it takes to grow a business there, and the best way to approach investors. Join some of the superstars of the investment and business world as they share advice from their time in the US so you can make your mahi count in this massive market. The Investment Fix podcast, brought to you by Invest New Zealand. Tune in today.
So when we first met, Red, like I said, you had this real clarity of vision. And a sense of what the publication would, how it would sound, and I think Olivia, you just alluded to this, that crucial sense of we are writing for a disabled audience in the voice that we understand and have never heard in sort of expressed in public spaces. Beyond once you've done that big co-design process, how did you go about assembling that into a kind of coherent vision that you felt like was ready to start the process of going from a big idea into something that would ultimately be ready to launch?
It's funny. I think one of the things that I've probably always known, but only recently kind of have been able to put words to, is that I think in many ways the D-list has always existed, and I think anyone who, I'll explain what I mean. I think anyone who is part of a kind of historically marginalized or underserved community will understand this. They'll understand the experience of having kind of this one world where you hang out and share in-jokes and like deeply painful experiences with your community, and then you'll go out into the kind of mainstream media spaces and kind of consume narratives and stories that feel wildly divorced from these authentic experiences you're having over here. And so I think to some extent that was actually the easy part, like putting the kind of the vision, the kind of strategy, the threads around the D-list. I mean, they're just there. You go hang out with a group of disabled people, it's all there. And I think it was just about how do we bottle that essence of being in those community spaces and make that and turn it into a brand, that people know and trust, and how do we keep that experience as kind of editorially tight and consistent as possible, whilst also acknowledging that there isn't any one experience of disability. And I think that's one of the things that can freak so many people out, so many non-disabled people out. It's like, oh God, how do I do disability storytelling when I've got, wheelchairs over there and then blind people over there and deaf people over there? And it's like, it can all just feel a bit overwhelming, right? And I think that's part of the reason why there's such a scarcity of good kind of journalism and or storytelling out there about disabled people. But once you get disabled people driving those kind of those visions and those vehicles, then I think that's when you unlock the magic. I think, unfortunately, what we're also dealing with is like generations of conditioning to believe that disabled people aren't capable of doing this work. I think the classic experience for disabled people is being invited onto an advisory group or some sort of sounding board without any real ability to drive the execution and delivery of a thing. And so I think that's what's fundamentally different about the D-list, is that we've got disabled people leading our board, we've got only disabled people on our staff, and we really believe in the power of people with disabilities to make this thing happen. And so I think it's not hard for us, it's not scary for us, and so much of what the D-list is and hopes to be is just already in disabled people. It's just bringing that to the surface, and I take so much inspiration from the places like E Tangata and the work that Mahitahi's doing on Instagram at the moment with the Tūturu campaign and, other publications by historically marginalised communities that kind of just do that thing of surfacing community values and surfacing community energy in a way that feels really congruent with those communities. And I really hope that the D-list can be that for disabled people as well.
So one thing that you've done, and I think this is where it really speaks to that, that wanting to be a step change in the, almost in the tone, more than anything, of disability or storytelling in this space, is like this thing looks amazing. Like it's got a really kind of poppy brand feel that kind of feels like it will naturally encourage a very sort of fresh, modern, authentic voice. Whereas, when you think about sort of, community-centric journalism, for whatever reason, it tends to be that that's almost an afterthought, that just telling the story is enough, and that if people, that getting people to it is almost like, or making it feel kind of cool or modern is almost like somehow betraying it. You can feel that way in terms of the way that design is handled. Where did that come from, and how important was it for the pair of you to kind of feel like this was, this had a real look and feel, a very considered look and feel to it?
I mean, first of all, huge hats off to the creative team for the work they did on the brand development. I think it's extraordinary. But I also think it's come from this desire to really give brand disability a kick up the arse, because actually, again, it's this bizarre kind of experience where, Liv and I, we have so many amazing, cool, capable, hilarious disabled friends, and yet you look at kind of brand disability more broadly out there in the community, and it's just fairly bleak. And it's like, actually, how do we create a brand that reflects the people and the spaces that we spend time in, and actually makes disability feel like somewhere that you want to spend time and you want to hang out. We deserve that. We deserve to have spaces that are cool and fun and aspirational. And I think, a lot of inspiration was taken from, the journey that the queer communities have gone on around the way in which they harness joy to bring people together around a common kaupapa and around a common cause. And I really hope the D-List is a place for disability joy, somewhere that young disabled people in particular finally see a space where they are reflected, where they want to be, seen, where they want to hang out. And I actually think brand is often hugely underrated as an ingredient to make that happen. It's often the thing that gets the least resource, that gets the least kind of consideration. But I think for the D-List, I wouldn't say it many places other than this podcast, but I think brand is a huge part of what we are, our initial offering, at least, as a way to bring people together.
Yeah, I mean, as looking, when we kind of set our editorial vision and things like that, one of our values is that we will be beautiful in terms of we want it to be just visually just attractive and, and we're lucky we have, funding and resources to make it to the high standards, as other media organisations. And yeah, I think because disability has been in this kind of like medical type model for so long, and when you look at kind of like medical disability type spaces, it is very like clinical and boring type websites where it's just information just put out there in bullet points. Whereas, yeah, the design is just so beautiful and stunning for the D-List. So yeah, we want it to be a space where people feel welcome and want to be part of it.
Do you have a sense of how it will sort of operate and express? I mean, it's the gift and the curse of digital publishing is that you can basically be anything you want. What kind of story forms you'll aim for, audio, video, how you'll use social, even down to kind of relationships with other publications and how you will, because the other hard thing is just growing an audience in 2023 is different to it might have been in prior eras where there was a bit more free distribution available. Do you want to speak to that a little?
Yeah, I guess one thing that's, in terms of like launching and going live, a lot of the work that's been done leading up to this, all the co-design, all the communities, all the relationship building that Red's been doing for the last 2 to 3 years is really vital in terms of our audience. Our audience is disabled people, and I think, we've reached, this community really well and built really good relationships. We're not going to be putting out a press release to every mainstream news organisation to write a news article about it, because that's not our audience. So I think that's what's really cool about, attracting our audience. And so in terms of content, we are navigating that and figuring out what our voice is as we go live. We've got an amazing group of a small group of contributors at the moment who are, being part of the co-design process as well and totally just get it. And we'll be writing opinion pieces, columns, and doing news as well. And wanting to, in terms of news, it will be from that kind of really strong disabled lens in terms of what disabled people want to know about. And so, yeah, it'll be a mix. And I think eventually we will be wanting to do more kind of multimedia stuff. But like any kind of organisation or launch, you just want to go live and just figure it out as you go along. Just the amount of support we've had before going live has been amazing as well. So all the people, who've heard of it and want to get involved, even if they're not regular contributors, just the excitement around it has been really exciting.
How have you gone to sort of find your people? Because as you said, Red, if that there hasn't been historically a lot of disabled journalists or sort of who are outwardly or explicitly focusing on that community, so how have you kind of, especially in this, it's not quite stealth mode, but certainly pre-launch mode, built out that community? And if there are people, whether they're listening or they know someone who they think would be a great contributor, what's your sort of process for finding that group who will become your core of creators?
I mean, certainly what I found so encouraging, and I shouldn't say not surprising, but not hugely surprising, is just how much latent appetite and demand there is for a space like this. You know, every single disabled person that we've shared this concept with has been like, oh, great, about damn time. You know, like it's really is the sense that we've all been sitting around waiting for finally for someone to reflect our worlds in a way that feels remotely aligned with how we experience them. And so I think in many respects, it's actually been a real delight working with our initial batch of content contributors. And generally they're found through relationships. Liv and I joke that sometimes it can feel like there are only about a dozen disabled people in New Zealand because, you know, we tend to get an outsized share of the kind of airtime. And I think the job of the D-list is to make sure that it's not those usual suspects showing up in this space every time. You know, we do want to broaden the tent. We want more people to feel like actually disability is an identity in a space that I can feel proud to be a part of. I think that's really one of the things we're working towards. But what I love about the initial batch of contributors that we've got working for the D-list and writing pieces and doing illustrations and doing kind of audio stuff is that they're not just the usual suspects, they're not the famous disabled people, but they're also people who are on a bit of a journey around what it means to identify as a disabled person. What does that mean for me? And I think, you know, I've got this amazing illustrator down in Wellington who, you know, is actually quite well known within New Zealand, but has also lived with an eye condition their entire life and has kind of been on this, and actually tells a story in their illustration beautifully on the side at the moment, tells a story of their kind of journey in and out of disability community spaces and where does she fit and, you know, what's her kind of journey around using the word disability? What does that mean when she uses that word? And how disabled do you have to be in order to use that word? You know, these kind of really complex and quite existential questions that hopefully the D-list can create a space to kind of unpack and explore and for people to find their own tribes within that. You know, we keep coming back to this idea that there is no one singular or homogenous experience of disability, and how do people find their own groups within that, you know?
And so you're launching this week, and you know, with all of the kind of bundled energy, nerves, excitement that goes along with that, how will you know it's working? Like, have you got a sort of an idea in your head about the kind of signals that will sort of tell you that's you know, moving from that kind of the sort of co-design and the conversations to like the live product?
I'm keen to hear your thoughts, Liv, too. I think for me, if we don't have the trust and support and awhi and tautoko of our communities, then like we might as well pack our bags and go home, you know? And I think we have to keep walking that really delicate line of both creating compelling content that, you know, builds that audience, that grows our kind of, grows our audience, whilst at the same time working at the speed of trust and working at the speed of our communities and making sure that we don't get so carried away with this exciting, you know, new toy that we are building that we forget about, you know, parts of our communities that have actually been doing the battling for you know, have cleared the way for us to do this. You know, if people didn't fight for deinstitutionalization in the 80s, people like Olivia and I would still be living in hospitals. You know, if people didn't fight for minimum accessibility requirements in the building code, we would not be able to get into this building today. So I think there's a lot that we can sometimes take for granted, and I think it's about taking our communities with us, making sure that they are vibing with this work, making sure that we are listening deeply and making sure that we are responsive to what they are telling us, whilst at the same time holding a vision for something that just doesn't exist right now. It's so hard for us, for disabled people, to imagine something new when it simply doesn't exist right now. And I think part of what our job is actually is to fight that kind of the lack of permission to imagine something different that we just haven't had for such a long time. What about you?
Well, I was going to say I want every place to have ramps after we launch. No.
Feels reasonable.
No, I guess from an editorial side of things, part of my job is, I've had this kind of career in a mainstream news organisation which is used to the churn, is used to kind of deadlines, but I guess the nature of the media industry, like any other industry, is not really designed or set up for disabled people. So I guess for me, part of my job is to create a space where, there's kind of two sides of me. There's like one side, I want to bring in all the best disabled writers that can write for the D list, but also like young disabled people or people who want to write may not have have had that environment that can support them to get to that point of, we're talking about high editorial standards and, high expectations. So my job is I want to be able to foster an environment where people feel comfortable to do that and kind of gain the skills. And it's working at the pace of the environment as well. And so I guess, seeing content on the D list that is, a range of different voices, different disabilities, different perspectives, and also quite, scene setting in the media industry as well.
So lastly, that's the sort of how will we know it's working on, in the first few months piece. But let's kind of look ahead to a future. What would be an amazing sort of vision of what success looks like for the organisation? I think when we first spoke, Red, you said that there isn't not much like this, not just in New Zealand, but almost anywhere. Like, do you have a vision for growing it beyond this country, or at least using it to address issues and culture beyond our borders in a way that might resonate with disabled people all over the world in some respects?
I think there are two things, right, that are kind of have that are symbiotic in some respects. So we talk about the D-List being the home of disability culture in Aotearoa. We really want to incubate and grow and manifest a greater sense of who we are as people, and coming to the D-List for that kind of taste, if you like, of disability culture. But at the same time, we also know that disabled people are a woefully underrepresented group of people across society in Aotearoa, right? Whether particularly within Parliament, but if you look across the board. And so I think part of our hope is that we can get kind of disabled people to be understood as a constituency that it's not okay to ignore anymore. I think right now, it feels very easy to put disability in the too hard basket because of the medical lenses that Liv talked about earlier. And I think really the opportunity here is to put disability on the map as a proud and mobilised constituency, mobilised set of communities who are demanding better for our people. And I think right now it's so easy for us to be ignored by people with power. Because actually our systems are set up in such a way that makes it, it's actually very straightforward to do that. So I do hope that we can manifest this home for disability culture into actually an advocacy space and a mobilisation space. Again, I take so much inspiration from the proud history of the queer rights movement and the way in which they were able to bring people together around a common cause. And they started with their community first, right? And they mobilized and they agitated and they kind of formed that sense of solidarity. And it was only at that point that allies were invited in. But fundamentally, it was the allies piece that tipped things over the edge as far as mainstream civil rights legislation changes go. And so, it's no surprise to me that the recent conversation around the accessibility legislation in Aotearoa kind of, lacked that same degree of loud, raucous sort of allyship, that we've seen in other parts of society. And so I really hope that we can turn this kind of emergent space of disability culture into a more kind of full-bodied advocacy vehicle in time.
Honestly, it's such an amazing achievement even getting to this point, and yet I have the strong sense that there is so much more to come out of the D-list. Thank you both so much for coming up on the fold today, and really looking forward to see where this thing goes.
Thank you.
That was The Fold, brought to you by our partners at oOh!media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. Huge thanks to oOh!media for sponsoring this episode of The Fold and enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.
Ready to rediscover the joys of cycling? With over 300 kilometres of cycle paths across Tāmaki Makaurau, jumping on your bike and going for a ride is such a fun way to discover the city from a different perspective. Cycling is getting more and more popular across Auckland, so now's a great time to join the hype and give cycling a go. Head to at.govt/cycling to find your nearest cycleway today. The Spin-off Podcast Network.